The Magical Monkey's Paw, Part 1. Outside, it was a cold and wet night, but inside the cozy little living room of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire was burning brightly. Mr. White and his son Herbert were playing chess. Mr. White liked to take risky moves, which often led to trouble, and tonight was no different. Mrs. White, knitting by the fire, occasionally looked up and smiled at their game. "Listen to the wind," said Mr. White, trying to distract Herbert from a mistake he had made. "I'm listening," said Herbert, moving a piece on the board. "Check." "I don't think he'll come tonight," said Mr. White, hesitating over the board. "Mate," replied Herbert, ending the game. "That's the problem with living so far out," Mr. White complained suddenly. "This place is terrible. The path is muddy, and the road is flooded. Only 2 houses on this road are occupied. It's like no one cares." "Never mind, dear," said his wife gently. "Maybe you'll win the next game." Mr. White looked up quickly and caught a knowing glance between his wife and son. He smiled and hid his grin in his beard. "There he is," said Herbert as they heard the gate bang and footsteps approaching the door. Mr. White got up quickly to welcome the visitor. Soon, he returned with a tall, burly man named Sergeant Major Morris. The Sergeant Major shook hands with everyone and took a seat by the fire. Mr. White brought out some whiskey, and after a few glasses, the Sergeant Major began to talk about his adventures in faraway places. He spoke of wars, strange lands, and mysterious people. 21 years of it, said Mr. White, nodding to his wife and son. When he left, he was just a boy working in the warehouse. Now look at him. He doesn't look like he's been harmed, said Mrs. White politely. I'd love to go to India myself, said Mr. White, just to see the sights. Better stay where you are, said the Sergeant Major, shaking his head. He put down his empty glass and sighed. I'd like to see those old temples and fakirs, Mr. White continued. What was that story you were telling me about a monkey's paw, Morris? Nothing important, said the Sergeant Major quickly. Just a bit of magic, I suppose. Monkey's paw? Said Mrs. White curiously. The Sergeant Major hesitated, then took something out of his pocket. It was a dried, shriveled monkey's paw. Mrs. White made a face, but Herbert took it and looked at it curiously. What's special about it? Asked Mr. White, taking it from Herbert and examining it before putting it on the table. It had a spell put on it by an old fakir, said the Sergeant Major. He wanted to show that fate rules people's lives, and those who try to change it will be sorry. The spell allows 3 different men to each have 3 wishes. His manner was so serious that the little family fell silent. Why don't you wish for something? Said Herbert. I have, said the Sergeant Major quietly, his face pale. And were your wishes granted? Asked Mrs. White. They were, said the Sergeant Major, and he tapped his glass against his teeth. And did anyone else wish? Asked Mrs. White. The first man had his 3 wishes, yes, said the Sergeant Major. I don't know what his first 2 wishes were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw. A hush fell over the room. If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, said Mr. White. Why do you keep it? The Sergeant Major shook his head. Fancy, I suppose, he said slowly. I thought of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough trouble already. Besides, people think it's just a story. Those who believe it want to try it first and pay me later. If you could have another 3 wishes, asked Mr. White, would you take them? I don't know, said the Sergeant Major. I don't know. He dangled the paw between his thumb and finger and suddenly threw it into the fire. With a cry, Mr. White quickly snatched it out. "Better let it burn," said the sergeant major seriously. "If you don't want it, give it to me," said Mr. White. "I won't," said the sergeant major firmly. "I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Throw it back in the fire, like a sensible man." Mr. White shook his head and examined his new possession closely. "How do you use it?" he asked. "Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud," said the sergeant major. "But I warn you of the consequences." "Sounds like something out of the Arabian Nights," said Mrs. White. "Why don't you wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?" Mr. White took the paw from his pocket, and the family laughed as the sergeant major grabbed his arm with a look of alarm. "If you must wish," said the sergeant major gruffly, "wish for something sensible." Mr. White put the paw back in his pocket, and they all sat down for supper. The monkey's paw was almost forgotten as the sergeant major continued to tell stories about India. After dinner, the sergeant major left to catch the last train, and Herbert joked about the monkey's paw as the door closed behind their guest. "Did you pay anything for it?" asked Mrs. White, looking closely at her husband. "A little," said Mr. White, coloring slightly. "He didn't want to take it, but I made him. And he told me again to throw it away." "Likely story," said Herbert with a laugh. "We're going to be rich and famous now. Wish to be an emperor, father, so you can't be boss around." Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and looked at it doubtfully. "I don't know what to wish for. It seems like we have everything we need." "Wish for 200 pounds to clear the house," said Herbert. "That would do it." Smiling at his own foolishness, Mr. White held up the paw. Herbert, with a solemn face, gave his father a wink and played a dramatic chord on the piano. "I wish for 200 pounds, said Mr. White clearly. There was a sudden crash from the piano, and Mr. White let out a startled cry. His wife and son rushed to his side. "It moved," he said, looking at the paw with disgust. "As I made the wish, it twisted in my hand like a snake." "Well, I don't see the money," said Herbert, picking up the paw and putting it back on the table. "And I bet I never will." "It must have been your imagination, Mr. White," said Mrs. White, watching him closely. He shook his head. "Never mind, there's no harm done. But it gave me a shock." They sat by the fire again, and the two men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was louder, and Mr. White jumped nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A strange, depressing silence fell over the room, lasting until the couple went to bed. "I expect you'll find the money tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed," said Herbert, "with something horrible watching you from the wardrobe." He sat alone in the darkness, watching the fire. As it died down, he saw strange faces in it. One face became so horrible that he reached out for a glass of water to throw on the fire, but his hand touched the monkey's paw instead. He shivered, wiped his hand on his coat, and went up to bed. This adaptation is based on a short story, The Monkey's Paw, by W. W. Jacobs. If you enjoyed this part of the story, please consider subscribing to the channel for more updates and remaining parts of this story.